What's up, Internet?
Jordan here from Arrow to the Mead, and today we're going to be mixing beer and cider. I'm just going to call it apple beer, which probably means someone's about to drop into the comments and let me know that this has been done before and what the official name for it is. Actually, I did try to look into that, and it turns out there is a beverage on the other side of the pond called Snakebite, which is 50-50 lager and cider. So it's similar, but it sounds like, at least as far as I can tell from Wikipedia, it's a mixed drink. And I'm going to do this all as just one fermentation from beginning to end. Anyway, regardless of what you want to call it, let's get into it. So the original inspiration for this brew is just leftovers. I had some malt extract left over from the elderflower braggot video, and I had some apple juice left over from the blueberry cicer video. So I thought, what the heck? Let's see what happens if I mix them together. Curiosity, for better or for worse. The first step was to pick the hops. Because I was using leftovers for the base ingredients in this recipe, I wanted to make sure that anything else I picked was chosen thoughtfully in an attempt to actually get something at least somewhat cohesive out of the apple juice and the malt extract. So with that in mind, I decided to go with Galaxy hops. I didn't do a ton of research on it, so there might be betters out there, but I found out that Galaxy hops are fairly well rated for their flavor and aromatic profiles of tropical and citrus, in addition to secondarily ranking for apple and pear. I didn't see anything at a glance that was like super high on the apple spectrum, but I thought some hops that had some of that kind of stuff going on might kind of help bring the beer side of things a little closer to the cider side of things and make them play together nicer instead of being these really weird contrasting flavors. That was the thought process anyway. It took me a few different calculators to try and get this recipe sorted out gravity-wise, because the Got Mead calculator that I normally use for all my mead stuff doesn't do malt extract. I ended up estimating the gravity of the 1 gallon I was going to make with liquid malt extract using Batch Builder's malt extract calculator. And then I just used a blending calculator to figure out how to mix that in with the apple juice, which I know from previous brews that I have used this exact same juice on has a gravity of right about 1050. If I did my math right on all of that stuff, it should come out to an original gravity of about 1042. Which has a potential ABV of 5.84%. And that was pretty much it for the gist of the ingredients, but let me go over the exact amounts for you here. 1.2 pounds of gold liquid malt extract, 1 gallon of apple juice, 1 ounce of Galaxy hops, half in the boil and half dry. Water to the 2¼ gallon mark, but keep in mind, because we are doing a boil here, you probably will need slightly more than that in total water volume. And then for the yeast, in keeping with the leftovers theme, I reused some Lallemand Windsor yeast that I got for the elderflower braggot by washing it. Following along the video that BC did over on the Doing the Most channel on how to wash yeast, which I'll put in the description if you want to check it out. But if you're buying brand new yeast for a recipe like this, 1 packet's fine. Now, I didn't really do anything in secondary on this one, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I did do bottle conditioning, and I decided to use 2 ounces of honey for my priming sugar for nutrients. Since this is only half beer by volume and slightly less than half beer by fermentable sugars, I just used the basic Batch Builder nutrient recommendations rather than trying to calculate out the yan added by the malt extract. And what I ended up going with was 6.25 grams of GoFirm to rehydrate my yeast, 3.9 grams of Fermado, 4.4 grams of Fermade K, and 0.8 grams of diammonium phosphate. And that wraps up our recipe, so let's get on to the process. The first thing I did was just take my gallon of apple juice and stick it in the freezer. Since I was doing this at the very beginning of my process, not like the night before or anything, it wasn't going to be in there for long enough to actually freeze and split open the carton. But it was going to cool down a fair bit, and that would help me bring the wort temperature down when I was done with the boil. Next, I heated up some water to dissolve my GoFirm in, and then started to let that cool off so it could get down to the 104 degrees Fahrenheit that the package instructions call for your yeast to be added in at. I find that doing this first thing is usually a little too long, especially if you have a boil to go through, but because I was trying to reuse washed yeast on this one, I wanted to give myself plenty of time to develop a backup plan if the yeast didn't wake up. I'd never washed yeast before, and I wasn't entirely certain that they were still alive. With the GoFirm prepared and beginning to cool off, I went ahead and put 1¼ gallons in my stock pot, along with the 1.2 pounds of liquid malt extract, and brought that up to a boil. Once I reached that healthy boil, I added in a ½ ounce of hops, and kept that boil for 20 minutes. While the hops were boiling, I kept an eye on my GoFirm and made sure to pitch my yeast when we hit that 104 degrees Fahrenheit mark indicated in the package instructions. I killed the flame after 20 minutes of boiling and let that cool for 20 to 30 minutes, at which point I pulled the apple juice out of the freezer and blended the entire mixture together. Adding in that chilled apple juice helped drop the temps down low enough that it was now pretty safe for me to transfer from the stock pot I was boiling in into my actual fermenter without too much risk of scalding myself if I spilled a little bit. Luckily, I didn't actually spill this time. Might be a first. I took this opportunity to add in pectic enzyme per the package instructions to help out with the apple juice that we're using here. And then I mixed that all in really well and added any water that I needed to get back up to that 2¼ gallon mark. Since we only boiled for 20 minutes, it shouldn't be too bad, but you may have lost a little bit of volume over that time. Now that I had topped off to my desired total volume, it was time to pull a quick sample and check the gravity. It came in about 1049, 7 points higher than I had calculated when I tried to math this recipe out originally. But then I remembered the lesson I learned on the elderflower braggot. Because I'm using a significant amount of malt extract, there was a good chance that this would not ferment completely dry. So being 7 points over the intended starting gravity is actually probably a good thing. It means I'll likely still end up about the same ABV, depending on how far we ferment here, but it'll be close enough. Now at this point I was just about done. I had to add the other ½ ounce of hops in a little brew bag, and then pitch my yeast, put a lid and an airlock on it, and fermentation was officially underway. And oh boy, did that thing take off like a rocket. I got a little video I took here, I think just like an hour after pitch, and the bubbles are just everywhere. I had to refill that airlock several times. Now because this wasn't all that high of a starting gravity, fermentation was done after just a few days, and it was time to rack, which went fairly uneventfully. The only weird part was that I have too many of my 1 gallon fermenters being taken up by the yeast overload experiment, and I had 2 gallons of product and only one 1 gallon carboy available, so I ended up racking into a 1 gallon carboy and then 2 ½ gallon carboys. Not a real problem, just a little tedious. Oh well, anyway, I ended up giving this about 2 months in secondary, which is a long time for a lower ABV beer-based thing like this, but apple tends to introduce a lot of haze in my experience, at least this particular apple juice that I have used on several other brews, and I wanted to try and give it a chance to settle out a little bit better than I did for the elderflower braggot. You may remember the floaties I had in that one. In addition, I wanted to take this time to experiment just a little bit before I committed to bottling the whole thing. I used my turkey baster to pull just 1 12-ounce bottle's worth off the top of these secondary containers, and then bottled that along with priming sugar so it could bottle condition and I could give it a try. And this is where I actually got the idea to try using honey for my priming sugar on this one. I did the taste test on that sample bottle and felt like it could use just a little tiny touch of extra complexity and character. Not enough that I wanted to introduce any serious secondary ingredients, but enough that I thought it might be worth trying out the honey instead of something really plain and straightforward like table sugar. In the end, I think it actually worked, but it could just be confirmation bias because I'm not doing an A/B test or anything like that here. I'm just comparing the one thing that I tasted several weeks ago to the thing I'm tasting now. Not the most scientific, but I feel like it helped. Anyway, that brings us to today. Let's crack open one of these bottles. All right, here we go. Moment of truth. I'm still figuring out how to do this pour for you guys the best I can. That looks like a beer. Not bad. Okay, the head came out a little aggressive because that wasn't the best pour in the world, trying to do it in front of the camera for you guys. But that's right about, I think, a good level of carbonation. I have finally struck the balance after 2 things that didn't carbonate almost at all and then one that explosively carbonated. There is a little bit of haze in here. I'm not sure how well it shows up on the camera. I know you're getting some glare off of my lights and computer monitors here. I can see it almost like a tornado or something in there because it was a little bit of extra sediment that settled at the bottom and then came out when I poured. But it's just a little bit of haze. It's very fine, not big and chunky stuff like I had on the elderflower braggot, so I think the extra time in secondary did help a little bit with this one. And again, like I said on the elderflower braggot, I think a certain amount of haze and stuff like that is inevitable when you're doing bottle conditioning instead of forced carbonating, but this is much closer to what I think it should look like. So that's a good start in terms of the clarity and whatnot on this one. All right, well, let's get on to the taste testing, shall we? Is it weird if I step away from the mic so I don't ASMR you guys? ASMR makes me uncomfortable. Can I taste test from back here? Is this all right? Okay. So after spending a little bit of time with this, the initial reaction is going to be that it's, well, A, it's a little bit weird, and B, it is exactly what you would expect. It is half beer and half cider, and it tastes that way the entire way through the tasting experience. From the nose to the palate to the exhale, every step is half beer, half cider. Now you can offer some specific commentary on that, but it's all pretty much what you would expect, like saying that, oh, well, the galaxy hops show up in the nose. Well, yeah, that's what they're for. And it creates kind of a weird reaction in my brain, because a lot of the stuff that I homebrew doesn't taste like anything I can buy commercially. That's usually part of the fun for me. This, though, it tastes very similar to two things that I can regularly buy commercially and have frequently done in the past. So it's trying to categorize this into these existing categories of beer and cider, but it doesn't quite fit into either. In order to appreciate it, if you will, I had to kind of categorize it a new way. If I try to judge this as a beer, it doesn't necessarily rank super well. If I try to judge this as a cider, it doesn't necessarily rank super well. I needed to find some way to think about it so that my brain would allow me to categorize it as its own unique beverage and then judge it on its own merits, rather than how it stacks up to other beverages that aren't even the same thing. And what I eventually settled on was Starbucks. I know that probably sounds a little weird, but think about it. This combination of malt and apple cider, it's got kind of a seasonal fall, autumn thing going on here. And it does sort of lockstep with the aesthetic, if you will, of seasonal Starbucks beverages. I'm not saying it tastes exactly like them. It has some flavor similarities in terms of, the cider and whatnot, but it's not like it's a vanilla chai latte or whatever. It just kind of feels like it has that same sort of aesthetic to me. And you know what really locked that in? Is cinnamon, and specifically, a cinnamon sprinkle. So give it a little bit of a sprinkle on top, and a little bit of a stir. There you go. That hits the spot. The cinnamon really helps to push this into its own unique category, and then I can appreciate it. But if you look at this as a beer, or if you look at this as a cider, you're probably not gonna like it very much. That might be a super weird thing to say. Hopefully it makes sense to you guys and I don't sound crazy, but this helps a lot. Now, you might ask, would you then brew this with a cinnamon stick and secondary for a couple months then? No, actually I wouldn't. You could, it would probably work okay, but I feel like the cinnamon sprinkle on top actually helps with the aesthetic. Because of all those Starbucks beverages that are so infamous, if you will, during the fall time, I feel like that really kind of helps set the mood for this beverage, and it's one of the things that helps push it over into its own category. Now, I have seen virtually zero conversation about the presentation of a beverage on basically any of the BrewTube channels that I've watched, and I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing. I think most of the time, you probably don't need to worry about presentation. But in this particular case, for the reasons that I've tried to outline here, I think it actually helps a lot. Now, if you just hate the idea of putting cinnamon sprinkle on a beer cider hybrid, then, well, either don't make this or put a cinnamon stick in secondary. It'll probably get you a similar flavor profile. But I think this really helps. Now, instead of this tasting like a weird beer or a weird cider, it tastes like we managed to make an alcoholic beverage out of that cinnamon applesauce that we all thought was just amazing as kids. At least I hope that wasn't just me. Anyway, other than the cinnamon, I can't actually think of much that I would change about this recipe. It is certainly a unique flavor profile that I know won't be for everyone, but I wouldn't make it any different. And honestly, to my palate, I think this is pretty well balanced. Now that I have successfully categorized it so that I can judge it on its own merits instead of comparing it to things that it's not, and I think it provides a very entertaining and unique tasting experience. Now, because I am pretty sure that this is going to be a little out of left field for some of y'all's palates, I can't necessarily make a blanket endorsement of it. I would basically say, if you like experimenting just with weird flavor combinations to see what it tastes like, and this sounds like a fun one to try, go for it. Knock yourself out. You'll have fun, and you'll definitely get a unique tasting experience out of this one. On the other side of things, if you're into those seasonal Starbucks beverages, and come this autumn, you want to find yourself curled up under a blanket with a friend or a loved one, ready to watch a movie with a cold glass of a half beer, half cider hybrid that's got cinnamon sprinkles on top in your hand, brew this. Hopefully that gives you guys enough information to make a choice about whether or not you want to try this one or just watch from afar. If you do brew this one at home, let me know in the comments how it turns out for you, or if you made any tweaks that you think improved it. Either way, this has been Jordan from Arrow to the Mead. Thank you for joining me, and have a good however long until I see you again.
'Cause I'm still looking